Dress reveals a great deal about our moral attitudes, both as they pertain to us as individuals and to the wider world. Aileen Ribeiro. That is a quick excerpt from the postscript of the book Dress and Morality by Aileen Ribeiro. Also, I have made it a bit modest to show you guys. Hi, my name is Maki. I have a degree in costume design. I am also incredibly broke because of that degree. And that degree also gave me a really bad habit of collecting costume resource books. And I have like an entire bookshelf dedicated to it. It's really bad. It's not great. On to the book, Dress and Morality by Aileen Ribeiro. This book was kind of enthralling to read at times and incredibly engaging. I personally thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, and I'm going to go through it section by section now. I will also probably be quoting a lot of it since it's so interesting. Sue me, except don't, please. I don't have that money. Quick content warning. Due to the content of this book, some phrasing may be extreme or explicit. And for those reasons, I'm also going to very rarely be showing the actual visuals due to quite a few nip slips. So the first part of the book is going to be the introduction. I don't typically have the introduction included, but since this one says so much, I've included it as our first section. It lets us know that the book is going to focus on Europe and more closely at England. And it also lets you know that it's going to work through fashion chronologically, which is a huge plus for us. Religion also sort of has a strict ideal of what should be worn and what shouldn't be worn. She says on page 13, in some communities, fervent religious zeal is linked to a fierce rejection of what is seen in Western decadence in manners and in clothing, which is a very interesting way to put it, even though this book does come from a Western standpoint. There is something that is always sort of going to be parroted throughout time, and that's the idea that women's bodies are sort of inherently shameful or sinful, and that they like seek to enact temptation. This mindset in particular, sort of what men and authority figures place on the body. On page 17, she says, in the same way as in the past, perhaps there is still a lingering echo today. Female beauty was a satanic temptation to men. Women were admired for it and yet denounced for it. Another interesting thing is just the concept of the demonization of the human body in general, just based on it existing. On page 18, she says, pagan art celebrates the body and does not condemn it, and Christian art tends to serve God and not to illustrate sin unless it be the wickedness of Eve. Going off of that, this book is often going to bring up the viewpoints of Christian ideology and the words of Christian moralists. I am not going to debate religion with you guys. I'm not going to do it. If you want to fight about something, we're going to be fighting about this book in particular. This section rates overall for me a 9 out of 10. The next section, which is our official first chapter of the book, is going to be titled 1, Body and Soul. This chapter in particular is going to sort of cover the Greek to Roman pipeline and the start of the inevitable fall of Rome. I know that I just said that this is going to focus on Europe and on England, but the reason why we are first talking about the Greeks and the Romans is because of that pre-Christianity idea of morality. It's just very important to cover the topic and the baseline, what we are coming from, and those predating customs versus Christianity's ideas of morality. So that is why we are covering the Greek and Romans first, even if they are not always in England. Sometimes the Romans are in England. There is a very interesting thing that she brings up about the idea of nudity versus nakedness. On page 19, it said, the Greeks, said art historian Kenneth Clark, created nudity and the Christians created nakedness. The Greeks look at the naked body with pride. The Christians regarded the naked body as shameful, indicative of suffering, humiliation, and because of Eve, of betrayal. Interesting with history at that time and fashion at that time, trade is going to open up the opportunity for people to have finer cloth, such as Egyptian cottons, Eastern silks. This is also going to be seen as unmodest cloth since it isn't the natural or native cloth that people typically wear. It's pretty sinful to wear false hair. This idea is sort of going to be brought up later in chapters over time. Wearing other people's hair, ew, gross, sin. It's also very sinful to sort of engage in the frivolity of rich materials and cosmetics, which are happening at this time. There is also an interesting dichotomy we need to bring up about the strict Roman dress codes and the structure of Roman dress versus the sort of loose, artful Greek life in drapery. I know sometimes when we look at the past, we sort of see these things as synonymous. So we just really need to keep in mind that there are some pretty drastic differences between the two of them. A lot of historical costume pieces are mentioned and explained, such as the Doric peplos, Ionian chiton, a Himation, a pallium. Even lets us know that Alexander the Great introduced sleeves from Persia in the 4th century AD, and early on, such ideas of having sleeves on your clothing is seen as effeminate and gay. There is, once again, that sort of inherent sin and guilt of women to sort of live and breathe as Eve did. The author quotes Simone de Beauvoir, who then goes on to quote early Roman Christian author Tertullian on page 27, "Woman, you are the gateway of the devil. You persuaded him who the devil dare not attack directly. Because of you, the Son of God had to die. You should always go dressed in mourning and in rags." This chapter is going to rank a 10 out of 10 for me. If I could read like sonnets about this era for forever, I would be so freaking happy. Chapter 2 is going to be called Vile Bodies. This chapter covers the early Anglo-Saxon era to the 14th century, so the 1300s. Men are sort of indulgent for having personal care and hygiene, and women are, just indulgent regardless. On page 35, we sort of quote Orderic Vitalis in his earliest 12th century text, Ecclesiastical History. He's talking about the popularization of beards once again on page 35. "All of our fellow countrymen are crazy and wear little beards, openly proclaiming by such a token that they revel in filthy lusts like stinking goats." This is also a period in time where men wore their hair long and curled with irons, and that is also particularly shameful. An interesting thing I want to bring up in terms of a visual resource in this book is going to be this picture. It is the Temptation of Christ in Winchester's altar, circa 1150. This is going to be on page 37. It's a detail shot. I just think it's really interesting because the devil in particular is depicted in feminine dress. There's always going to be sort of varying opinions about the roles women play in society, whether it's in literature or art or socially. On page 37, it says, "At church, women would have heard sermons depicting them as foolish creatures, too prone to follow the desires of the flesh and subject to pride and vanity. At the same time, they might be seen as heroines in courtly romances placed on a pedestal and worshipped." Once again, people just sort of hate women, and it's a little sad. Fashion-wise, Trade develops more, but to engage with it is, again, to be sort of loose with morals. You shouldn't be engaging with the cosmetics of India or the silks of the East or rich colors or which you're using to dye cloth, unless you sort of like seek to tempt insolence. Sumptuary laws and church doctrines also at this time sort of aim to regulate ungodly dress. Very interesting note also that I heard was that tighter fitting clothing sort of begins with side lacing on the tunic. Specifically, that is a trend beginning in masculine clothing rather than feminine clothing. Once again, people just sort of hate women. The text Roman de la Rose is quoted on page 38 and says, "Woman is the confusion of man, an insatiable beast, a continuous anxiety, an incessant warfare, a daily ruin, house of tempest, a hindrance to devotion." It also sort of seeks to be mentioned that women are urged to marry to avoid ruin and make themselves attractive to their husbands, but, not too attractive to tempt other men when they are married. They must be beautiful but chaste, well-dressed but not a financial burden, and seen but not heard. This chapter, to me, ranks overall a 9 out of 10. Sorry, I am fixing my seating arrangement. The third chapter is going to be titled The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. This covers the 14th century to the end of the 15th century, so if you do the math correctly and you carry the 2, that's going to be the 1300s through the 1400s. Also, you heard it here, folks. Clothes equal hell. On page 43, it says, "From the beginning of the century, women had begun to wear the sleeveless surcoat, and gradually the armholes were widened until it became virtually a sideless gown to the waist. As it increasingly revealed the tightened bodice of the gown beneath, it was denounced by some moralists as a dress with windows into hell." Which I think is kind of a hysterical thing to say about a garment. Men's fashion during this period is going to be more foppish and ostentatious and flamboyant. The term fop is not used yet at this time. It just correlates. So I'm using it. Because of that, in particular, we are talking about these like teensy tiny, itty bitty, short men tunics with hose that is so tight it's kind of like leggings of modern time. At some point, because of how teensy tiny, itty bitty these are, they sort of end up displaying sort of the old flesh chandelier, to not use explicit wording. Be warned of kneeling pages and bowing knights, because you might see something of theirs that you want to scrub from your brain. As always, cosmetics and practice hygiene are sort of a surefire gateway to the devil. I have another artwork that we are going to show, which is going to be Saint Anthony led to the armorer's shop in 1426. It's going to be a French manuscript illuminated by Robin Fournier of the Life of Saint Anthony. The ladies in the piece are shown with headdresses known as borelettes, or padded horns, with the addition of devilish horns. It also depicts the queen as having an outlandish long train and trailing sleeves dragging to the ground, further cementing the idea of the uncleanliness of her image. I thought that was pretty dang cool and interesting, and as mean as they're supposed to be, I kind of am digging the women are the devil, women are demons in artwork. It's very interesting to see, and it's just fun. It's kind of just fun. Once again, everyone hates women. We're gonna note this like common theme that we see many times, sort of regarding sexual assault cases. So it's really truly sad to see how far back this mentality goes. On page 47, She says the French poet Eustache Deschamps in the 1380s believed that such low necklines drove many men to think of rape. Yeah, this is a thought process that we continue to see even now, which is just really sad. On a slightly brighter note, you think I forgot religion in this chapter? No, I didn't. On page 58, Christianity had no difficulty in finding scapegoats for the economic and political failings of the world. It had found in certain forms of dress the temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil. This chapter is going to be an 8 out of 10. I'm back, sorry. Chapter 4 is going to be titled Ship of Fools. This period is going to cover the 1500s Renaissance. Men at this time are more often than women doing the deceptive and devilish manipulation of their body with styles such as like the peas cod belly, which is like the fake belly, insanely huge sleeves, insanely huge trunks, although trunks sort of like shrunk in size at the 1560s to make more of a modest size that really showed the hole downstairs, and the codpiece. I want it to be known at this time that I really want to applaud the author's attention to detail in dress. She like truly opens your eyes to the period and the ways to characterize people in dress to make them foolish or rich or to even make them evil. Ruffs, like, you know, the Tudor ruffs that go around your neck, those were apparently just horrible regardless of size, make. At this time, they still really got pretty large due to the introduction of starching. The unstarched ones still seem to suck. The unstarched ones, though, were said by Puritan Philip Stubbs in his The Anatomy of Abuses, which is mentioned on page 70, that even unstarched ruffs were dismissed as unsightly. They goeth flip-flap in the wind like rags that flow abroad, lying upon their shoulders like the dishcloth of a slut. He has such a way with words. Also at this time, stays, or what we now know in later periods to be known as corsets, but back then they were still stays, caused miscarriages, I guess. Supposedly, this constricting nature of theirs to cause babies to leave was worn by women of loose virtue for this reason. In Pleasant Quips for Upstart Newfangled Gentlewomen in 1595 by the Essex person Stephen Gosson, also on page 70, the body busk keeps down flat, the bed wherein the baby should breed. Which is probably a lie. That doesn't sound truthful at all. Masculine details, masculine silhouettes in women's dress is particularly shameful, as said by homie Puritan Philip Stubbs. Again, in regards to women wearing men's sort of beaver hats, ruffs, doublet-like bodices with shoulder wings and decorative aglets, is quoted on page 72. Such a doublet, says Stubbs, was a wanton, lewd kind of attire, properly only to man, and those women who wore it were guilty of stinking before the face of God and offensive to man. He has such a way with words, as we have already sort of established. This chapter ranks to me a 9 out of 10. Chapter 5 is going to be called Rags of Sin, Robes of Shame, and Provocations of Lust. This chapter covers the 1600s. Men are still getting a pretty bad rap with clothing, especially those who indulge a bit too much in it. The anonymous author of England's Vanity, or the Voice of God Against the Monstrous Sin of Pride in Dress and Apparel in 1683 on page 89 says, sneered at those pretty men who have gotten the bodice on to make us look slender and pretty, and the obscene sleeves do very well fit both the he and the she. Women with clothing and fashion, as always, are sort of like blasted to smithereens. The 1615, the arraignment of lewd idled forward and inconstant woman, or the vanity of them, choose you whether. Author Joseph Swetnam, on page 80, says, she has 1,000 ways to entice thee, and 10,000 ways to deceive thee, and to suck away thy wealth, but in the winter of thy misery she will fly from thee. He implored men to remember that many women are in shape angels, but in quality devils, painted coffins with rotten bones. The literary titles for things at this time are kind of insane and super, super long. And if you have not noticed, it is a little bit hard to say them all at once. In fashion as well, there's quite a bit more bearing of the breast and the cleavage. Feelings about these trends being seen around town, or even for shame in church, very, very much shame for the devil live in the sort of mindset. Women are called the whore of Babylon and all the other names you can think of. There's also quite a large 1630s scandal called Bare Arms. Not bear. Bare Arms. The poet Herrick in Taylor's A Glass for Gentlewomen to Dress Themselves in 1624 is quoted on page 82. He attacks women for bearing their arms beyond that which is fit for every one to behold. This seems a surprising and unwarranted attack until it is realized that although women had very oftentimes worn very tight sleeves, their arms had not been revealed, in public at least, since classical antiquity. The bare arm was to the 1630s what the ankle was to the Victorian. What a scandal. There is also sort of that age-old argument against false hair. Most chapters are going to mention the sin in general and in particular. I just have not brought it up again since way back. This time in particular, it's going to be full head wigs, half wigs. They're going to be made of either human or animal hair. The wigs are also like huge, and they tower over people, even sort of covering half of their face. There's also a very loose and sloppy, uncouth freeness to clothes at this time. They are not as tight or structured as they were in the past. Page 82. Whereas the loose gowns allowed a languor which, to many critics, positively reeked of sexuality, allied as it was to a passion for contrived negligence. 9.5 out of 10. Chapter 6 is going to be the vanity of human wishes. This chapter is going to cover the 1700s, so that Rococo or Marie Antoinette period that everybody loves, loves, loves so much. At the beginning of the period, it is sort of immoral to hide the body under loose dress and clothed items, such as hooded cloaks, which prostitutes wore apparently, or a gown known as a mantua. This is initially a loose, informal gown with a casual draped overskirt that then evolves later in the period to be a formal overgown with stylized back drapery, much like a robe à la Françoise or a robe à la Anglaise. Those Rococo gowns that we all know and love. At the end of the period, in contrast, the style is more the fitted chemise-like gowns. These are often made with flimsy muslin or silk gauze and supposedly showed far too much of the figure. This silhouette is going to be seen up until like the 1820s and is similar to the styles that we see in the popular Netflix show Bridgerton. Mid-century, the Puritans are sort of going to come back in full force. There is a small excerpt from a sermon of Isaac Watts, Puritan, on page 101. While you are dressing, should you forget that you are sinners, and therefore should put on shamefacedness. For all our ornaments and clothing are but a memorial of our first sin and shame, and when we take a pride in our garments, it looks as if we had forgotten the original of them, the loss of our innocency. There is a huge source of immorality at this time known as the masquerades. They originated in Italy in the early years of the period, and they were popular in theater, private houses, and even the pleasure gardens of London, due to the occasion requiring attendees to wear masks and disguises. It sort of gained the reputation of being an environment where vice is going to fester and sin is going to breed. There's also sort of a funny note of blaming natural disaster events on this party and the immorality that these parties bring. On page 104, the Great Earthquake, which devastated Lisbon in 1955, was attributed to God's wrath at the masquerades, and they were rather ineffectively banned for a year in England. The author also notes that Emperor Justinian had, in the 6th century, done sort of the same thing and stated that his belief the earthquakes were caused by homosexuality. God, I wish we had that much power. Anyways, caricatures are popular at this time, and also satirical art sort of over-exaggerating fashion trends, which is seen on page 108 of the anonymous French engraving. The anonymous French engraving Toilette de la Duchesse de Plumes ou le Triomphe. I'm gonna stop and I'm going to put it on the screen, and also the translation of it. This exaggerated the towering hairstyles of the period, specifically with peacock feathers as a headdress. Very funny. She is going to be wearing an obscene wig. Men are now being called macaronis. We love a macaroni. They're also supposedly called Billy Wiffle, a name specifically attributed to an effeminate styled man with laced clothes, heeled shoes, and that sort of pompadoured wig. One sad note is that popular feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft sort of denounces fashion in her A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. The author notes on page 117 that she links fashion with frivolity. It is a belief which many feminists today hold dear, agreeing that an air of fashion is but a badge of slavery, that an immoderate fondness for dress is the passion of savages. Keep in mind when she mentions feminists of today, the book was initially published in 1986, so that is the today that she is talking about. This chapter is going to rank a 9.5 out of 10. Drink. Chapter 7 is titled The Great Divide. This chapter covers the 1800s. At this time, men's clothing is going to be pretty somber in terms of color and cut. Women's fashion is, of course, lambasted for being frivolous and excessive. Fashion trends include tiny waists, large balloon sleeves, wide skirts, excessive color, high-necked daytime dresses with low-cut evening gowns, flounces of many colors, and crinolines and corsets. Crinolines and corsets also apparently augment nature, and the hatred of them was reported on actually by Queen Victoria in a letter addressed to the ladies of England. In 1863, on page 130, she stated her strong approval of the wearing of the indelicate, expensive, dangerous, and hideous article called the crinoline. Aww, sad. French fashion at this time is also sort of treated as some horrifically, scantily clad vice and terrifying spectacle of immorality. On page 121, we read that France is the gay land of trifles and dissipation, that its people pursue sensuous or frivolous pleasures with a devotion to the shrines of luxury and vanity unknown at any former period, and that women in particular parade in public places in a state of undress really immodest. On the other hand, English fashion is very garish in appearance, and we even have accounts that sort of compare English fashion to the fashion of low-class whores. One historian even found that the period with the greatest immorality was the mid-19th century. Masculine silhouettes seen in women's clothing are, again, immoral and wrong. The concept of ladies wearing pants, which is an idea created by the American Amelia Bloomer of the Bloomer, was scandalous, and even the idea of bifurcated underclothes was risky and unwomanly. Bifurcation meaning pants or shorts, things with legs. We do see some women wearing bifurcated garments or pants in sports later in the period, but to some that was still way too much. Female cyclists wearing this uncouth, manly outfit could be barred from service, and this is the sentiment of having the opposite gender being seen in your clothes is also heavily criticized going the other way, with feminine and the masculine, and those known as dandies are heavily criticized for their padding of the figure and bright, garish colors. On page 141, the author says, dress reform for men was a non-starter whether seen as artistic/effeminate in the late 19th century or overtly masculine in the late 1920s. Men have been singularly resistant to any radical change in dress which does not evolve naturally from the immediate preceding style, which we still see now. An interesting thing that I learned in this chapter about this period is that before the Edwardian period, men's swimming costume was nothing. It was a la mode. It was naked as the day they were born. In the Edwardian period, that is going to change, and they are going to actually be wearing bathing costumes or swimming costumes. It's not as much of a problem as you would initially think, seeing as women and men did not usually swim together before that time. Fashion's ever-changing mind sort of degrades women. There's sort of an outlandish idea that the corset brought a sexual thrill and pleasure to some people, and that the use of some cosmetics to mimic the changes in a woman's face during the sexual act. Those were both ideas that were thrown out at the time, which are crazy and wild, and I guess you can think that. Supposedly on page 144, some of the more radical dress reformers felt that fashion had been used by men to incite lust and degrade women. At best, it had ensured that their minds were occupied by frivolity and not by more weighty matters. Other ladies at the time are growing really tired of the constant jabs and critiques at their images and supposed morals, and they're just sort of being like, please get on with what is pretty right now. This chapter is going to rake an 8.5 out of 10. Chapter 8 is going to be titled Dress and Disorder. This covers 1900s to 1980s. Again, the book was published in 1983. If you are a lover of anything vintage or antique, you know that this period of time cycles through what seems like every single trend in fashion. For that reason, I'm not going to be touching them all, just the snippets that jumped out to me in the chapter. One of the snippets being, you'll never guess, racism. The 1904 author of The Sins and Scandal of the Smart Set supposedly says on page 146, the Americans had, along with slang and free and easy manners, introduced jazz, a Negro melody of indecent postures and exaggerated steps, which set men and women barking, leaping, floundering about on all fours, trailing costly gowns and crumpling dress shirts in the endeavor to recapture the lost art of apes. Disgusting. I looked for the actual author of this racist trash. Her pen name was supposedly Rita, and she was listed as being Eliza Humphreys. You suck. During this time, there was a particular emphasis on the idea of having luxury underwear and delicate and pretty lingerie. That has sort of become the fashion of the mode. This was, of course, immoral and a side of society's degrading propriety. This, along with sort of the introduction of V necklines and the brassiere, were truly the beginning of the end for moralists. We sort of have that scandal of the 1920s, that scandal being it's quite boyish. There's loose attitudes and short hair on women. Lady Walpole responded to a reporter from the Weekly Dispatch who asked her, "What is a modern girl?" in 1925, and she said, quoted on page 154, "She is an inane, insane, eaten-cropped, useless, idle, mannish young woman who smokes doped cigarettes, uses bad language, wears practically no clothes, and is an abomination to her fellow creatures." She seems like a hoot and a holler. I'd love to hang out with her. The fashion at this time is often going to be shorter dresses, loose fit, minimum underwear and shapewear with shoulders bare and stockings displayed. It's going to be quite the scandal. But due to these changing fashions, the public is no longer going to be horrified by the idea of bare flesh. One note I want to say is that the last true religious attack at this time is going to be by one Mr. T.I.W., a self-titled Christian businessman, in his pamphlet titled Modest Apparel, an Earnest Word to Christian Women in 1931. The author states on page 157, "Those who wear sleeveless short dresses and even shorts had waited in vain for some godly sister in Christ to condemn this dressing like harlots." He thus takes upon himself the burden, stating that, as women have always been the instruments of Satan, it is not surprising that by their dress they should tempt hapless men to crimes of passion. Great job, dude. Traditionally masculine clothing seen on women is, again, a problem, and you could be homosexual for that reason. This trend starts to be seen in the mid-1940s of girls who began wearing men's dress shirts and jeans, and overall seeming sloppy in dress because of this. There was also the feminists seen in previous years say that women's dress is frivolous and a feminine weakness, and then they adopt masculine clothing to free themselves, but instead they're sort of dressing like the costume of their oppressor to win a moral high ground. I think you should wear what you love. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I think. There is a brief femininity in men's clothing scene in the 1960s and 1970s with longer hair and frills on shirts and, God forbid, flared pants. There are always usually subcultures known as teddy boys or boudoir boys and other more notable ones such as the punks and the goths that are going to challenge the status quo and introduce some inherently non-masculine styles into fashion. Ultimately, slower styles in men's clothing is going to reign supreme. Fashion is always going to change. It will ebb and flow and curl itself around the human psyche and follow society's beck and call. The author states on page 171, "We may feel that in some case our conscience should dictate to us what to wear or not to wear, but we cannot avoid the dynamism of fashion and style. It is implicit even in the humblest working garment." Even to sort of refuse to engage in fashion and in trends is to engage in fashion. And I think that's a really important thing that we would sort of want to keep in mind even now. This chapter ranks overall to me an 8.5 out of 10. Final thoughts. Drink. This was incredibly long. And I'm really sorry, but I'm also not sorry at all. If you've been keeping track of the math, this book being Dress and Morality by Aileen Ribeiro, scores an 81 out of 90 or a 9 out of 10 on the Mackey scale. I love this book. It was an engaging read. I learned so much about the work. But when I looked online for the price of the book, it's sort of all over the place. If you can get your hands on it, I would say definitely go for it. The content of this book, I would say, is like a mid-level book to the topic of fashion history and costuming. It's not the most introductory text, but the topic at hand is truly interesting and explores the sort of changing of fashion and the conversation around it, so I would really highly recommend it. Again, due to the topic at hand, dress and morality, in case you forgot, the content can be a bit explicit, and the visual media even more so. You will see a nipple, or 2 or 3, just kidding, probably more. I personally believe that this is an invaluable costume resource for designers. You get fashion history information as well as cultural viewpoints of the garment. This is really going to inform your design of how to show foolishness, extravagance, dubious morals, and even innocence in a character. For those working in costume construction, this book is going to be less valuable, but still an incredibly good read if you want to know more about the period. There is, I will say, ample information about historical undergarments that is going to be a beautiful aid for any build. This book was amazing. The author uses words and examples from others, but she still has a really strong voice. You get so many resources mentioned and also shown in the bibliography. Also, nerd/dumb person alert. This is one of the first times that I've ever actually engaged with the citation section of the book, and it was incredibly well organized. Have you read this book? Have you read this book? If so, please let me know your thoughts on the book. I loved it. I'm gonna fight you on that. Also, if this long-form content is maybe too long, keep up with my slightly shorter reviews on Storygraph under the same name, Aquilily. Thank you so much for sticking around this long. I am actually having a lot of fun reading my books, which is a huge shocker, I know. Goodbye, I guess.